Hi, everybody, and welcome. This National MS Education and Awareness Month teleconference series event was made possible with support from Genentech, Bristol Myers Squibb, Sanofi Genzyme, Biogen, EMD Serono, Novartis, and Viatris. This presentation has additional support from Ocrevus. I'm your host, Kimani Hendricks, Multimedia Communications Coordinator for MS Focus, and today our speaker is Amy S. House, Ph.D., whose topic is Surviving Suicidal Thoughts, followed by a question and answer session. Dr. Amy House is a licensed psychologist and a professor in the Department of Physiatry and Health Behavior at Augusta University in Augusta, Georgia. She has over 20 years of experience in the treatment of borderline personality disorder and traumatic stress, and has a passion for helping people who struggle with severe emotion dysregulation, chronic suicidality, and self-harm behaviors. She has also a specialty in mental health needs in women. She is dedicated to supervising and training others in evidence-based psychotherapy approaches, including DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. She is director of the Augusta Dialectical Behavior Therapy Program and has facilitated peer consultation groups for both ACT and DBT for many years. We're pleased to have her join us to present this important topic. Dr. House, thank you for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you so you can share your slides.
All right, thank you, Kamani. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. I am going to share my screen. Okay. Have I done it?
Yes, you have.
All right. Okay. I think we're going now. So I'm really glad to be here and talking with you about this topic, which is really important to me. It's a passion of mine to help people who are struggling with suicidal thinking. And so I'm glad to sort of bring to you the best that psychology has to offer on how to help people who are struggling with these things. And I want to start with the question of, what makes human beings vulnerable to suicidal thinking? Because I think if we can understand that, if we can understand some things about suicidal thinking and what makes us vulnerable to it, then it's actually easier to handle suicidal thinking when it shows up. So there's a couple of things that make us vulnerable as humans to suicidal thinking. And one of them is that we just have really tricky minds. We have minds that are evolved for the purpose of solving problems. Our minds are incredible problem solving machines. They solve all kinds of problems throughout civilization for making our lives better. They solve problems really, really well in our external environment. It just seems like they're not as effective at solving problems when the problems are things that show up inside of us, like our thoughts, our feelings, memories we're having, body sensations. When we turn our problem solving efforts to those kinds of things, it seems not to work quite as well. We don't seem to be able to change those things the way that we can change our external environment. And yet, because problem solving works so well in other parts of our lives, it seems like we keep wanting to do that over and over again. So, just like the little guy in this cartoon who does not want to be out of a job, our minds don't want to be out of a problem solving job. So they just keep over and over again trying to solve problems as they show up. Another thing that really contributes to this is that we live in a culture, especially in Western culture, where we kind of are socialized to this idea that normal mental health means happiness. That if we're not happy, there's a problem. That happiness is normal, and not being happy is not normal. And we get this idea from sometimes from our families or our teachers or people around us. And we also very much get it in advertising. So, you get the idea that if you're not happy, um, then if you buy a product, for sure, you will be happy. And because we sort of live in a culture in which happiness is sold to us as a normal state of being, if we find that we're not happy because of normal life, right? Like normal life brings us sadness, it brings us disappointment, it brings us losses, it brings us anxiety and fear and anger and a whole like full range of normal human emotions. But very often we just haven't been taught like how to manage those normal human emotions when they show up. And so our minds might just go to work thinking that those emotions are problems to solve. When we have painful thoughts, feelings, and memories that show up, and um, we're not happy, then it may be that we begin to treat these internal experiences like problems to solve. And what do? We sort of tend to have kind of uh, an agenda to either fix it or avoid it. So we either try to fight them off, get rid of them, suppress them, or fix it in some way. It's as if we kind of get into a tug of war with our internal experiences. And how well does that work? How well do our efforts at fixing and controlling and avoiding our emotions actually work? Well, I want you to do a little experiment with me to find out. So, what I'm going to ask you to do is just for a second, close your eyes, and whatever you do for the next 10 seconds, try not to think about warm chocolate cake. Don't think about it. Push it out of your mind. Don't think about how it smells when it first comes out of the oven. All right, so open your eyes. How did you do? Was anyone able to not think about it? No. I mean, if you're like most humans, you probably were, yes, somebody was able to not think about it. I mean, even if you were able to not think about it, the only way you know you're not thinking about it is because you were first thinking not chocolate cake, right? Like that's not chocolate cake. So even inside of like not thinking about it is thinking about it because you have to compare the thing you're thinking about and so on some level to chocolate cake to make sure it's not that. So what the research shows us is that in fact efforts at suppressing thoughts don't work, and that the more you try to suppress a thought, the more of that thought you actually have. And the same is true with feelings also, that the more we try not to feel something, the more you end up feeling it. So we actually can end up, in this sort of paradoxical struggle with our thoughts and feelings. And so it seems to be that when it comes to our inner experiences, the rule is the more you don't want it, the more you have it. And then what happens? What if I mean we can experience this, and yet we keep sort of trying the same strategies over and over again. Why? Because sometimes it works. Like sometimes for thoughts or feelings that aren't that important or aren't that intense, it might work for a little while, or it might work temporarily. Um, and and so those sort of short-term successes kind of can keep us at these strategies. um, but what if, the thing that you're facing is the loss of someone that you love and you're feeling really intense grief? Is that really an emotion that you can fix? And or what if the thing that you're facing is the anxiety of uncertainty about the future if you've lost your job or if you're facing a diagnosis and you don't know what that means for you in the future. So that's probably not something that you can avoid. So these strategies don't really work long term. So we can end up in these kind of vicious circles where we have these unwanted inner experiences, thoughts, feelings, memories. We make efforts to avoid or control them. They're not completely successful. We end up with even more sometimes of the thoughts and feelings that we don't want or and in the meantime, we sort of lose some openness and flexibility because if you're avoiding thoughts and feelings that you don't want, the likelihood is that you're probably also avoiding maybe certain activities, certain situations, certain people at the same time. So you kind of lose some openness and flexibility. And then when you find that your efforts are not working so well, or you keep coming back to those same thoughts and feelings that you don't want to have, you may end up really judging yourself for it, criticizing yourself. Why can't I stop thinking about this? Why can't I stop feeling this way? What's wrong with me? And your distress may actually go up. And if you end up in this kind of cycle for um, for long enough, it may be that you become even more distressed um, to the point that uh, your your efforts to sort of get rid of things end up at kind of the ultimate effort to get rid of, which is kind of thoughts about getting rid of yourself. Um, and when suicidal thoughts show up, one of two things can happen. Either you get caught up in the suicidal thoughts, get kind of buy into them, get focused on them, ruminate about them, or you apply the same kind of fix it and avoidance strategies to your suicidal thoughts um, and really get in a struggle with suicidal thinking. Either way, you can really find yourself kind of stuck with suicidal thinking. So what I want to do in this presentation is tell you some things about suicidal thinking that might help you get out of those stuck places and kind of some exit strategies for exiting out of some of the stuck places that people can get with suicidal thoughts. So one thing to know is that suicidal thinking is surprisingly common. Um, we know about 10% of the general population. It varies depending on the survey, but about 10% of the general population reports sometime in their life considering suicide. Um, and in people with MS, it's even higher. So up to a third of people with MS report considering suicide at some point. Um, the uh, the data on whether or not people with MS die by suicide at a higher rate is somewhat inconsistent, but it seems like the consensus right now is that there does seem to be a higher risk of dying by suicide in people with MS. Um, we know that in general, among people who think about suicide, about a third of people who think about suicide will make a suicide attempt. So suicidal thinking is something to be taken seriously. Um, and it's not terribly uncommon. So when does suicidal thinking occur? Well, the best research that we have indicates that suicidal thinking occurs most commonly when a few factors are present. And one of them is that we perceive that the pain that we're in, and that can be physical pain or emotional pain, but we're experiencing some kind of pain that we perceive. And that's the key aspect here is that We perceive that the pain is interminable, meaning it will never end, and that it's inescapable, meaning there's nothing we can do to change it, to make it better, to make it less. We have no sort of control over it, and that it's intolerable, that we can't take it, we can't tolerate it. So when those three things are present, then we're at risk for suicidal thinking. Our minds start their sort of problem solving about how to escape this emotional pain. And it's especially true when our usual coping resources are overwhelmed. So the ways that we might usually cope with emotional pain or physical pain are not working or are not available to us. So the theory here is that anyone might have suicidal thinking when these factors are present. And in fact, I think the most helpful way to think about suicidal thinking is that it is problem solving behavior. Um, that it's our mind's attempt to solve the problem of our emotional pain. Now, I don't, as a therapist, I maintain that it's not a good solution, that there's always a better solution than suicide. Um, but it is a solution. It's a solution that minds generate under certain conditions. And it can create a sense of relief. If you're in what feels like overwhelming emotional or physical pain that it seems like is never going to end. There's nothing you can do about it. It feels intolerable. And you start thinking of an escape strategy like suicide, it can create a sense of relief. The problem with that is that if you're having a sense of relief, then um, it's like a little bit of a reward for your mind. So you have a sense of relief, it's a little bit of reward, and it makes it more likely that your mind is going to sort of keep going back to that as a solution. Um, I know another therapist describes it as like suicidal thinking is like a little vacation for your mind. And the problem is that over time, your mind tends to go on that vacation more frequently and have a harder time coming back. And um, so this is why people often need professional, or I would say, if you're having suicidal thinking, you need professional help to kind of change that pattern of thinking. I think it's just as important to say what suicidal thinking is not. It is not the truth about you or your life. When you're having suicidal thoughts, your mind will tell you you're a terrible person, you're hopeless, your life is hopeless, there are no other solutions. And it's important to know that that is not the truth about you or your life. It's also not a sign that you are weak or broken. It is a sign that you are stuck. You are stuck in some unworkable ways of thinking and unworkable patterns. Um, but it's not a sign that you are weak or broken. And so, you know, uh, I have, for a lot of my clients, it's a sign that they have a sort of a learning history. They've learned a pattern of thinking of suicide as a solution or as an escape strategy. And, their minds go there. Their minds start going down that path, even if they don't want their minds to do that. So it's just become an automatic response. And that's an automatic response that they can learn other responses to, right? So that's what we do. We sort of learn other automatic responses, but it's not a sign that you're weak or broken. It's just a sign that you're in pain. Um, so that's what I want to say is that the first step in surviving suicidal thoughts is to recognize them for what they are. They're a sign that you're in pain and you need help. Um, so, what kind of help do you need? Where do you get that help? That's what the rest of this presentation is about. Um, most immediately, I would say there are suicide prevention lifelines, chat lines, text lines, websites, all of which can be super helpful. So the 1-800-273-TALK line is a lifeline for suicide prevention. It's available 24/7. And they also have the online chat available at their website. Um, a very cool website is nowmattersnow.org, which actually has videos that do some skills training on skills to help people through a suicide crisis. They also have some videos from people who have recovered from suicidal thinking and survived suicide crises, and they offer their kind of advice and inspiration. And there's a crisis text line there. You can text home to that number 741-741, and someone will text chat with you if you're in a crisis. The next thing I would recommend is getting professional help from a psychotherapist. And here, the research would really support the idea of getting what we call suicide specific care. So, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that in the past, there was this idea that if you could kind of identify the underlying disorder and diagnose that and treat that, that would make things better. So, if you, for example, if you were depressed and we could identify that you're depressed, diagnose depression, treat depression, then that would help prevent suicide. And the research just isn't really clear that that's actually the case. So, we've had decades of treating depression, millions and millions of people taking antidepressants, and our suicide rates just don't show that that's actually helped to reduce suicide rates, right? So in terms of preventing suicide, the latest thinking is suicide specific care is actually really important. If you have depression, you should still get your depression treated or your anxiety treated or whatever is under, whatever emotional disorder you might be experiencing. The fact is that um, suicide is not specific to any one emotional disorder. So, people with anxiety have suicidal thinking, people with depression have suicidal thinking, people with a range of emotional disorders can have suicidal thinking, and people with no diagnosis, no sort of emotional disorder or mental diagnosis at all can also have suicidal thinking. So it's not specific to any one of those. But so getting suicide specific care can be really helpful for reducing the overall risk of suicide, preventing suicide, and solving the problems that are leading to the suicidal thinking. So there's a few different things that are listed there. One is suicide specific CBT. CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. And there are a couple of different forms of suicide specific cognitive behavioral therapy. What they have in common is an effort to help um, the the client really identify, what are the things that lead to suicidal thinking. How can you identify those warning signs and the things that cue up suicidal thinking, and then what are some of the skills and strategies that you can begin to put in place to respond to suicidal thinking. What are some of the ways that you can solve the problems that are contributing to suicidal thinking? CAMS is similar to that. It's just a different format. It's called the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality. And so CAMS has a specific format to it. And DBT, or dialectical behavior therapy, is especially helpful for people who are struggling with chronic suicidality, or maybe who've already made a suicide attempt. And it's a rather intensive treatment. It involves individual therapy and skills training groups. Um, all of these therapies have in common that they have research supporting their effectiveness for reducing the risk of suicide. Okay, so beyond getting professional help with talk lines or therapy, what are some other things that you can do? So I'm going to give you some strategies that you can use. One um, are some really immediate strategies, and I call these crisis survival strategies. There's actually a whole bunch of crisis survival strategies. These are just two of them. So the idea is if you're thinking of suicide, you might very well be in a crisis, in a suicide crisis. And the goal in a crisis is to survive the crisis, just to get through it. And when you're in a crisis, one of the things that's very often happening is that your emotions are really intense. You're overwhelmed with those intense emotions. And when you're overwhelmed with intense emotions, no matter who you are, you can't really think clearly. It's hard to problem solve or to think flexibly or sort of see all the sides of things if you're in a lot of intense emotional or, for that matter, physical pain. So, um, ideas for sort of getting yourself to think more clearly is to sort of calm your physiology, to kind of get your physiology more regulated. So these are two skills for doing that. One of them is paced breathing. And the idea in paced breathing is that you pay attention to the pace of your breath and you just slow the pace of your breath down until you are breathing at the pace of about 6 breaths per minute or one breath every 10 seconds or so. So you can do that with me right now. Just we'll take a couple of breaths together at a slow pace. And so if you'll breathe with me, inhale, exhale, and inhale, and exhale. And that was just 2 breaths. But what you would do to practice paced breathing is you would keep going like that for maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes, maybe longer. And you would begin to feel the effects of that physiologically. Another strategy that can be really helpful is using cold water. And so, what you want to do with the cold water is activate what's called the diving reflex. And so, the idea is that you can there's a couple different ways to do this. One is to fill up a sink with water and dunk your face in cold water. The idea is that you want cold to actually hit the skin around your eyes and the temples around the temples of your face. And when that happens, you're sort of activating a dive reflex that tends to just sort of calm your whole physiology. Now, if you can't, um, bend over a sink and dunk your face in cold water. It also works fairly well to get ice packs and kind of wrap them in a towel and put ice packs on your face, hold them to your face. This also has a similar impact. Again, the idea in both of these strategies is that when you're in a crisis, often your emotions are overwhelming you and you're just trying to calm your physiology so that your brain can kind of think a little bit more flexibly and you can survive the crisis. Now, what are some other things that you can do? One of my favorite things to do is to help someone create a coping card for suicidal thoughts. Now, it works best to do this when you're actually not having the suicidal thoughts, but you're trying to kind of anticipate that you might have them again. And this is also something if that you can sort of do with a therapist or with a friend. Um, but the idea is that when you're in a crisis and your mind is kind of overwhelmed with intense emotion, it can be hard to think. And so if you have some ideas and some skills and some strategies and some phone numbers written down, then you don't have to think. You just have to find your card and read it. So the coping card starts with your personal warning signs for when you might be heading into a crisis and you need to start using these strategies. So your warning signs are your warning signs. You have to sort of like notice, how do I know when things might be getting worse for me? But you want to think about, what do I do? What is my behavior? What do I feel like in my body? What are the physical sensations? What are the emotions? What kind of thoughts do I have? And just sort of jot those down on a card. And I just use, like, index cards for this. So write those down on an index card. And then next, you're going to write down some coping strategies. Like, what are some things that I can do that would be some coping strategies that I could use to kind of get me through the worst moments of this? You can write down the things that I just taught you, the paced breathing and the cold water or the ice strategy. And you can write down other things that you've done before that have helped you. So, um, maybe it's watching a favorite TV show. Maybe it's playing with your dog or petting your cat. Maybe it's, um, you know, um, engaging in a hobby, a craft, or an art that you do, or something like that. Maybe it's um, doing some kind of exercise. Um, then you want to write down your reasons for living. So you want to think about, what are my reasons for living? Who are my reasons for living? Um, who will be glad that I'm still around? And you want to write that down. And then you want to write down people that you can call for support, one or two people that you could call to just talk to, um, who would be glad to hear from you. And then finally, you want to write down the crisis numbers. And you want to have all of that available to you on a card, and then carry it with you or have it someplace where you'll be able to find it if you do end up, um, in a suicide crisis or thinking about suicide. Another strategy that I think is important has to do with beginning to cultivate a new relationship with your mind. So I started this talk by saying, I think that one of the things that kind of makes us as human beings vulnerable to suicidal thinking is just that we have tricky minds. And um, so we can help ourselves by learning to have a different kind of relationship with our minds. Um, so I say, first of all, your mind is not your friend. Your mind it has its job that it's doing its best, and it's not always helpful. It doesn't always tell you things that are helpful to you or that are workable for your life. Many times the things that your mind is doing or telling you are just things that's learned in the past, or it's engaging in old patterns or old habits, and those things may not actually serve you very well in your current circumstances or in your life right now. And so it can be helpful to just be able to kind of take a step back and see what it is that your mind is telling you, the things that your mind is saying, and notice whether or not that's actually helpful. Your mind is also not your enemy. It's not something to get into a struggle with or fight with or get mad at. It's just is what it is. It's doing its thing. Um, and so you want to treat it that way. You want to practice kind of noticing it and watching it, without necessarily kind of getting caught up in it or getting in the struggle with it. Um, the other thing to practice is really bringing your awareness into the present moment. So often, so much of our suffering is about our minds kind of being time travelers. They travel into the past, um, and ruminate over what could have been or should have been, or the things that have happened in the past that are difficult or painful, or our minds kind of time travel into the future and worry over what might be, what could be, what if. Um, and all of that can create a whole lot of suffering for us. And so practicing noticing when our minds are doing that time traveling and just bringing them back to the present moment over and over again, that can also be super helpful. And then practice being kind with yourself because we do have these tricky minds, and all of our minds do these things that are not so helpful. And so offering ourselves just kindness in the face of that, knowing that it's not our fault that our minds are tricky, and that our minds are not always helpful. And so offering yourself some grace and kindness in the presence of that. And I think that if you're interested or you're willing, that having a mindfulness practice can be uh, a super helpful way to really strengthen some of these skills. I want to address if you are concerned that someone else is thinking of suicide. What should you do? So there's a couple of things just to kind of add on to what I've already said. I think one thing to know is that it is helpful to be a supportive presence, to express caring, express support, to listen, to let a person know that you're available and that you're there to listen. Um, we know that having a connection to supportive others, to having a connection to meaningful activities, that these are protective against suicide. And so, as a person as a loved one or a friend or a concerned other, you can maybe help increase those connections. Um, it's okay to ask directly about suicide. You can't make somebody suicidal by asking about suicidal thinking. And if someone acknowledges that they are having those kinds of thoughts, then you definitely want to encourage them to seek professional help. The other thing to know is that if possible, if someone is having suicidal thoughts, then you want to talk with them and try to limit their access to lethal means, which means, limiting access to guns or limiting access to um, lethal amounts of medication if possible. Um, we know that half of all the gun deaths in the United States are suicides, and that limiting access to lethal means is one of the most effective ways that we have of actually preventing suicide deaths. I just want to leave you with a few suggestions for some apps that might be helpful. There are lots of cool apps out there. These are just some that I like or that my clients have found helpful. Wisa is actually an artificial intelligence chatbot app for emotion coaching. So if you're feeling sad, down, depressed, anxious, you chat with Wisa about what you're thinking and feeling, and Wisa chats back with you and offers you some suggestions. It's kind of cool. Virtual Hope Box is a asks you a series of questions and has a place, some access to resources, and has a place for some skills coaching and things like that. ACT Companion and ACT Coach are both based on acceptance and commitment therapy, um, which is one of the therapies that I practice, and also a therapy that's really helpful for a range of different problems, including um, a, adjustment to chronic illness and chronic pain. So those two apps can be really helpful for practicing some of the processes and skills and strategies of ACT. DBT Coach is an app that's designed to be used if you're in DBT therapy. But even if you're not in DBT therapy, it can be helpful because it has some skills coaching and things like that in it. And Insight Timer is an app that is helpful. It's my favorite mindfulness meditation app. So I included that in there. It's got a lot of um, free offerings in there for people who are wanting to learn mindfulness meditation. So what I want to leave you with is just this message that you can survive suicidal thoughts, you matter, it's a, and that help is available. So if you are struggling with suicidal thoughts, get help. And I'm happy to answer questions for as long as um, as long as needed.
Thank you, Dr. House. Thank you so much. To our listeners, you can ask questions in either one of two ways. You can type them into the chat box or use the raise hand feature in the app. If you're on a mobile device, you can click the screen to pull up the menu and select more, which is the icon with 3 dots, and you'll see the raise hand feature. And if you are on a computer and you want to raise your hand, then you can find that in the participants window, or you can send me a direct message and say, hey, I'm raising my hand, you don't see me, so that we can get you guys talking directly to Dr. House. So I guess while we wait to see if anybody does have any questions, I did wonder about something. In the past, I heard someone say that one may contemplate or attempt suicide to regain control they think they've lost. Do you think that there's truth in that, or having a disease or having multiple sclerosis or any disease really, do you think that, maybe something that you have been able to do that was second nature at one time is now foreign, and I can't do this and it's a problem, so I feel like this is my only way out? Do you think there's truth in that at all?
I'm sure that that may be a reason that some people um, are having suicidal thinking. I think the the reasons for suicidal thinking or the thought process that people have is sort of as varied as people are. And um, when you have a chronic illness, um, and you're faced with um, the disability that can go along with that, then certainly your mind might tell you that suicide is an option, or that's if you're having difficulty adjusting to that and having difficulty seeing how life might be meaningful or purposeful, um, given the things that you're struggling with, then it could show up as an option. um, that's when I would say, professional help is so important, because somebody else can really help you kind of think differently, see things from a different perspective, have a more flexible point of view.
I have a question and comment in the chat from
Hmm.
Casey. She says, you mentioned when people are writing a crisis card, they should include others who would miss them. And she says that she's been told by some depressed individuals that they didn't feel they had anyone who would miss them. And what would you say to someone in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I've had clients say that to me too. And so I ask them, um, when you aren't depressed, who do you think will miss you? Or if they have a pet, if you have a dog or a cat, would your pet miss you? Um, uh, I think sometimes when you're in the sort of worst of your emotional crisis, it can be really hard to kind of see those things accurately. And so that's why I really try to fill out these things when you're sort of not in the worst of the emotional crisis, um, uh, because the perception can be that other people don't care when actually that's not really true. And if you're talking to that person, you might actually be a person who would miss them and who care about them. So you could say, well, me, I would miss you and I care about you. So put me down, sometimes that's the person they need to put down.
Now, I did actually want to bring up the coping card, and I wondered if you could talk about radical acceptance. I've heard that term used in DBT before.
Mhm.
And do radical acceptance exercises tie into the coping card? And could you explain what that is for those that don't know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can tie into the coping card if that's a skill that you have, right? So the coping card is really for skills that like things that you know how to do that you could do in the midst of a crisis that would help you get through a crisis. Um, and radical acceptance it can be kind of a tough skill. So it's if it's something that you've learned and you know how to kind of do that and practice that in the moment, then you could put that on your coping card. Um, but radical acceptance means um, that you are accepting, and accepting can be kind of a tricky word because it can be interpreted to mean like resigning yourself or that you like something or approve of it, but it doesn't mean really any of that. What it means is that you are acknowledging reality as it is. And the radical part just means totally. It just means like you're accepting with your whole self, with your mind, with your body, with your spirit. You are opening yourself up to the universe, to reality, to your life exactly as it is. Doesn't mean you like it, doesn't mean you approve of it, doesn't mean even that you won't try to change it. It just means that you are opening yourself up, that it is exactly how it is in this moment.
Yeah, I've heard that term before, and it did confuse me when I heard it. I was like, wait, no, if you have, nobody likes having a chronic illness, nobody likes for bad things to happen to them, but we
No.
do have to accept it. And it's interesting because I think it's a practice that we all have to come to find ourselves doing, and we may not even know what it is.
Yes, because if you don't radically accept, then you can't take care of yourself, right? Like if you're not really accepting, that you have an illness, then you can't, then you may not really take care of yourself in your illness. So first, you have to radically accept that you have the diagnosis that you have, that your physical state is your physical state. That you have to sort of radically accept reality is what it is, and then um, you can begin to sort of look at what do I need to do to respond to this. But you can't really respond to reality effectively if you don't first like radically accept it is.
Yeah. I know this is a topic that no one really jumps up and down to to discuss, but has anybody out there have you guys ever, experienced anyone that, is suicidal, or were you yourself? Did you ever have any problems? Were you ever wrestling with this? If you wanted to share. I saw somebody raise their hand, but the hand went down. Oh, Peggy, I will unmute you. You're free to. Do you see an alert come up on your screen, Peggy? There you go.
I have MS and everything's slow. Um, my father was alcoholic and suicidal my whole life, so I um, I watched him go through that, and he did eventually kill himself, but he also had pancreatic cancer at that time, so I think that played into it a lot.
Mm.
Um, I've wrestled with it. I'm going through a lot more I don't know if it's MS or not. I was diagnosed with MS in 1972, and it's been a long time. But I'm having tremors now, and they seem to think it's essential tremor, which is a completely different disease. Um, and I don't know if I've got it in me to deal with another disease. I'd like to say that I do, but I'm not so sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, Peggy. And I think, you know, it makes sense that that would be so hard to be facing another diagnosis and to not, not know. What's so hard is the uncertainty about the future, right? That's sort of the uncertainty. And, I think this is where the practice of just bringing ourselves into the present moment can be so helpful, because we don't know what the future holds, and our minds, if your mind is like my mind, it just tends to imagine the worst. Like I don't for some reason I don't have a mind that tends to always imagine the best possible outcome. Mine only imagines the worst possible outcomes. And so I think most of our minds are like that, and then it just compounds the difficulty and the pain that we're in right now. So I can understand that that would be something you'd be struggling with. Thanks for
Thank
sharing.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peggy. Marcia, I see your hand up, so I'll unmute you and you can speak whenever you like.
Hi. This is personal, but I'm sharing with my my brother, who's a professional. In fact, he's in charge of a very prestigious job. Shared with me one night that he had a plan, and his plan was not to do something to prevent committing suicide. His plan was to do something to commit suicide. And I almost fell out of my chair, because what am I supposed to do with that information? Now, he was telling me after the fact that he wasn't going to do it anymore, but how do I ever be sure? So he and I were quite close. Now that he's remarried again, he doesn't share with me so much. So how do you ever check up on someone that you used to call a lot and say, hey, John, how you doing? Gone to your therapist lately? Staying away from the booze? Not, taking your medication? What do you do with people like that? And I mean, he has, he has some depression, and he's got some other things going, but he's got to be one of a bazillion people that are like that. How do you follow up on those people that now I've got it under control? Really? Do you? How do you follow up with those kind of people? I don't know what the answer would be to that question. I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I have an answer for you
I don't
either.
either.
I mean, I think if you have the kind of relationship where you can still call and say, hey, I was just thinking about you and wondering how you're doing, and just want to check and make sure you're doing okay, and that you have somebody to talk to if you needed to talk to somebody. And if you did, you could call me, like that kind of thing. I mean, if you have that kind of relationship where you could do that, I think you could do that. I don't know what else.
All right. Mm-hmm.
Right.
We do have I see your hand, Peggy. I'm gonna get back to you in a second. Kay says that it's so difficult not to ruminate on the past when MS was not always a part of her life. And she wants to know if you have any advice on how to forget or grieve the past. She says that her MS is worse now, and her vision is poor, and she's homebound, not very mobile. So she just wants to know if there's any advice for her.
Yeah, I would say um, you, I mean, obviously you're not going to forget the past, and the feelings of grief are totally understandable. This is kind of what I was saying earlier when I was talking about, life brings us painful emotions. Like this is loss and grief, and it just comes with the territory of living. Um, and so what I would say is you're not going to get rid of that or forget that. And maybe the best thing to do is to work on having compassion for yourself and offering yourself kindness, uh, and simultaneously, um, finding what you can do in this moment. And if you're struggling with that, I would say, again, I think professional help, therapy can be really helpful in in the grieving process, and also in helping you focus on building a life of meaning and purpose given what you can do now.
We have a question from Jill. Peggy, I haven't forgotten you. Got a question from Jill, and I'm going to unmute you so you can speak to Dr. House.
Yeah, it's not a question. It's you'd asked about family members who have taken their own life, which my oldest son did 2 years ago. And I'm just sort of annoyed that he took that away from me. That he went first before I could, because now I have to wait.
Yeah, that is so painful. I'm sorry that that happened.
I, in my own experience, I don't have multiple sclerosis, but similar to your story, Peggy, my father is deceased, and he made several suicide attempts on his life, some of which I didn't find out until I was older, but some happened when I was a child. And when he and my mother were together, he also had an alcohol problem, among other things. And he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder 6 months before he died. Now, he suffered a massive heart attack, but part of me believes that his mental finally caught up with his physical. And a lot of people who do know me well know that I am cheerful, jovial, happy-go-lucky person, but I wasn't always that way. I had my share of suicidal thoughts and attempts, and I have not sought treatment. I have never seen a therapist. I'm kind of almost afraid to do so. But what's helped me, I think, the most is faith, prayer, and just knowing that there are people who care about me, even when I don't think that they do. My mother told me once when I was open with her about my suicidal thoughts, it made her upset. And it made me think of what you said, Jill, about being upset that your son went before you and you're kind of miffed at him for doing what he did. My mother expressed the same anger toward me when I told her what I was feeling. And it's so ironic because she used to volunteer at a crisis hotline. So here she was talking other teenagers and people off the ledge, and then there's her own child not really opening up to share with her until I kind of got over that state. So it's easier said than done, but it does help to talk yourself off the ledge, no pun intended. Talking yourself out of it, even if you don't necessarily feel like it's going to do any good, it does help. It helped me, and I really wasn't gonna. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I wasn't
okay.
going to say anything.
That's okay, Kimani. That's okay. I'm going to step in for a second and give you an opportunity to collect yourself.
Please.
Thank you for sharing that. It's something that can affect all of us. And I want to mention, for those of you who have survived the loss of a loved one to suicide, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention does have support for people who have experienced that loss of a loved one, as well as support for people who have survived suicide attempts or for people who are suicidal. So that site is afsp.org, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Dr. House, what would you say to people who do feel afraid to go to therapy?
Well, I would say, give it a try. I think, I guess people have lots of different reasons for being afraid of going to therapy. I think there's a lot of misinformation or stigma or just false beliefs about what therapy is or what it's going to be like. And I would say, just to try it and see what you think. I mean, you can give it a few sessions, and if it's not helping you or you're not connecting with the therapist, you can find a different therapist or stop going. But I think it's worth trying. I think it's worth trying. And right now, one of the maybe silver linings of the pandemic is that most therapists are now doing teletherapy. So you can find therapists who will, meet with you from your home online. And that has really increased the accessibility of therapy for lots and lots of people.
All right, thank you for that. Peggy, did you have a comment that you still wanted to make?
Yeah, I just, I wrote it down here. Well, there were two things. There's a survivors of suicide group. I don't know how you'd contact them, but there is a group, an organization, and I was thinking of the lady who lost her son. And also the one that talked about the person with an alcohol problem, Al-Anon, is very helpful for that. And that's a real common topic in an Al-Anon meeting where you're dealing with a suicidal person. I go to Al-Anon, and part of the reason I do that is because of my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's helped me immensely.
Yeah, it's a tremendous program. And I think that the important...
Whoops, you went away.
I think you're muted.
You got muted.
There we go. I think the important point to take out of that is that there are numerous sources for support out there. There's so many organizations. There's almost certainly one that has something to address your particular situation, and there are services out there that can help you find the support you need. One of them, of course, is our organization, msfocus.org. If you need help finding the resources, we'll work with you to get you the resources that you need.
Thank you for that.
All right, any other questions, comments?
Casey, I can finish the outro. I'm sorry.
I'm very glad. Kimani, I will turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, that is all the time we have for now, guys. If you did miss any part of this conference, it will be available on demand on our MS Focus SoundCloud page, our MS Focus radio station, and the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation YouTube channel. And please follow MS Focus for times and access information on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our next conference will be Tuesday, March 9th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time with Dr. Pearl B. Werfel, whose topic is anxiety and stress management in multiple sclerosis. And I thank all of you guys for participating. Thank you to Dr. House, and we thank our sponsors for their support. Thank you all for sharing, and this was very helpful. Thank you, Dr. House.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.